This is the August community call. We do a community call once a month with a different agenda, but we always start with the latest version of the Moddable SDK. We have a big update this month with Moddable SDK 4, and that is paired with the release of some new hardware from Moddable, which is called Moddable Four. The key feature of Moddable 4 is that it runs modern standard JavaScript on a coin cell powered device, which is pretty wild. And so energy management is a big part of the new SDK release to support that coin cell operation of the Moddable SDK, of the Moddable 4, excuse me. So we're going to spend a bunch of time on that today, and then afterwards we'll have time for discussion. So we do a release once a month, roughly at the start. That release is stable, tested, considered a recommended update for everybody. We include with that detailed release notes, which is a great way to learn about new features in the Moddable SDK and keep up with changes that may be relevant for your project. When you're looking at the release notes, please also star our SDK on GitHub to show your support. It really makes a difference. Here's what the release notes look like. This is just the start. They always begin with some highlights and some news, and then get down into details below that. Thank you, as always, to our contributors. We are open to pull requests. We have discussions and issues on our repository, which people will make suggestions, ask questions, which will motivate changes in the SDK. So we appreciate that. We always learn from the questions and the suggestions people make. But the main feature of the Moddable SDK 4 is the NRF52 port. So let's talk about that. If you're not familiar with this microcontroller, it's from Nordic Semiconductor. It's well known for being one of the best kind of ultra low energy microcontrollers out there. There's a bunch of different people who have made development boards for it. You can see them on the image, very small ones like from Seed Studio to very big ones from Nordic, which have breakouts for everything you might possibly want to get to. So you can choose one that makes sense for your project. We've got new APIs here, of course, for energy management, and we'll be walking through those shortly. One of the things that is really cool and important to keep in mind is that while this is a new microcontroller port for the SDK, it is still the Moddable SDK that you know and love. And so the same APIs are generally available, the same tools are there and work in the way that you know. And so even though you'll be coding on a completely different hardware platform, you can bring along all the skills that you already have from working with the Moddable SDK. And so here's a nice example of that. This is the Xiao NRF52 from Seed Studio. It's a really, really tiny board. So if you're looking for something small, it's a great one. We've paired this with a round display that we really love. We've been using it in demos a lot recently. And we're running on it a clock app that was built originally for the ESP32 when we were developing our SVG and outline rendering support. And the display driver that is used for this screen was actually originally developed on the Raspberry Pi Pico. And so those things all came together from different microcontrollers and run perfectly on the Nordic. And you can see that secondhand sweeps really smoothly. So even when driving full color with outlines calculated in real time, the chip is able to keep up. So it's low power in terms of the energy it uses, but it's actually quite a powerful chip in terms of what it can do. You may also be thinking, looks awesome. I'll wait to see. I don't want to be the first one to start. And you won't be. We are using this port already with clients, and our client Brino is using it in production already. And so they're the leading producer of time-lapse cameras that are used in construction sites around the world. Their latest model, the TLC 300, is completely powered by JavaScript firmware. The user interface uses our Pew user interface framework. All the I/O is done using ECMA 419 standard APIs that you've heard us talk about before. And with all of that, the battery life exceeds what was originally targeted for the product. So really great results, really beautiful UI, as you can see there on the screen. Really nice performance, and all shipping. And that port that they're using is the same one that's now publicly available for you to use. So if you're curious about how to get started, you have a couple of options. If you want to control the setup and configuration and where everything goes very precisely, we have manual setup instructions that you can follow. That'll probably take you 5 or 10 minutes. It's not a big deal. But if you'd like just, have that done for you, I suggest starting with XSDev. This is a tool that Nick Hare created to automate the Moddable SDK setup and update and things like that. Nick was a guest on a previous community call and took us through that in detail. But you can see with just a few lines on the command line, you can get everything set up that'll get the Moddable SDK installed, as well as everything that you need for NRF52 development. So 2 easy places to start. Moddable Four now. This is the hardware from Moddable that's powered by the NRF52. As you can see, it's got a screen on the front and a coin cell battery holder on the back. I'm going to switch off screen sharing so that you can see one in real time. So this is a Moddable Four. You can see it's actually quite small. It's great. It is powered by a coin cell. So I'm just going to slide that in here and you'll see, you should see it power up. Let's see, get you a good view of the screen. So you can see there, right? It starts up immediately. You can see really nice, smooth animation. And I have a little jog wheel here on the side that I can use to quickly scroll through things. Sorry, it's a little hard to see. We'll show you a video of this in a moment. This device also, you can't easily see, but it has an expansion header on the side. So you can plug in jumper cables or even sensors. And so I'll just plug this in. Boom. And so you can see you can extend Moddable Four with whatever sensors or peripherals that you want. So really cool, nice small package, really zippy. I'm going to come back to slides now. Turn back on my screen sharing. And so let's talk about the details of what's inside. We built Moddable Four because we really wanted to look into what it meant to use JavaScript on ultra-low power hardware. That meant powered by a coin cell, operating for a year or more, which is no small challenge, but also still supporting an interactive user interface. And you can see it does all of those things. And when we looked at the existing low-power dev boards, some of those you saw in the earlier slide, they didn't really support that goal. So no screen, no user input, no battery holder. I mean, you could add those, but we wanted something that was all in one, not just for ourselves, but for you, so that when you get started with this, you don't have your first step being, procuring a bunch of parts and gluing them together and making sure you got the wiring right. So Moddable Four is an all-in-one starting point for working with JavaScript on ultra-low power devices. And to make this thing ultra-low power, it's not just the selection of one component, it's the entire design of the hardware. And so I'm going to take you through the components we selected and why. We'll talk about how, using energy management APIs, you can actually turn off individual components. So even though they're very low power, you can turn them off so that they use no power. At the heart, of course, is the microcontroller, and that's the Nordic NRF52. We chose it for a bunch of reasons. One is it's just extremely well documented and extremely well known, and that made it very straightforward for us to implement the port. And it will make it very straightforward for those of you who want to write native C code that interacts with the part. And so we like that it's a really, really well publicly supported SDK. It has BLE, and the implementation is extremely thorough and has really good compatibility. And so you're able to do both BLE client and server, sometimes called peripheral and central roles, on this part. So opens up a huge number of possibilities in terms of BLE features. It has a lot of RAM, at least for an embedded microcontroller. It's 256K of RAM. We almost, in working with it, have almost never run out of RAM because it has so much. So you'll really find it to be generous in that respect. And it's, as you saw, the performance is really great. It's only spec'd at 64 megahertz, but it's a Cortex M4, and with all that built-in RAM, it really delivers great performance. So that's the microcontroller. The screen's another interesting choice. I think the obvious starting point for most people building here would be to use e-paper or e-ink. But we went with a memory display from Sharp. And the reason is that it animates at extremely high speeds, up to 60 frames a second, but still almost uses no energy. And so you can see it's really smooth, and it's down to a tenth of a microamp to hold the image on the screen when it's not being refreshed. So extraordinarily low. The other challenge with ePaper is that when it does need to do a full screen update, it actually pulls a lot of current. And so it needs either a bigger coin cell battery or just a bigger battery. It can't run off of a coin cell. So these Sharp displays, we think, are a really great choice for these ultra low power scenarios. For user input, we chose a jog dial. This is something that lets you, as you can see here, kind of turn up and down or push to select. There's also a back button in there. Great thing about the jog dial is it doesn't use any power at all. Also just takes up very little space, but it's super fast to work with. There was a time when Sony built these jog wheels or jog dials into many of their products because of that. We looked at adding a touch screen, but again, energy use sort of ruled that out because the touchscreen has to be scanning all the time, and that energy consumption was prohibitive in terms of the coin cell. So this is using a jog dial. And then the last component that we added for energy management is a little maybe unexpected, which is an accelerometer. And as you can see here, of course, it's great for detecting the orientation of the device, and we can do real-time animations based on that here. The accelerometer is sensing gravity, basically. But the accelerometer also knows when the device is moving or not. And the motion of the device tells us if you're holding it in your hand or not. And so we can use the accelerometer's detection of motion for energy management. When you pick up the device, it can wake up. When the device has been stationary for a little while, it can go to sleep. And that allows it to automatically save energy without any explicit interaction from the user. They just use the device and it's ready for them. And when they're not using it, it goes to sleep. And of course, you can turn off the accelerometer if your project doesn't use it. So if it's not necessary, it literally uses zero power. So let's talk about some of those software features that allow you to optimize the energy of your projects. The main thing, as we talked about, is just turn things off. If you've never done power optimization, energy optimization in embedded, this is at the heart of it. And so, if something is off, it's not using any power, that extends your battery life. And so we'll see different ways of achieving that here. The first technique is something called light sleep. In the Nordic documentation, they refer this to system on sleep mode, which I've always found a little confusing, but it's important to know their terminology when reading their docs. When in light sleep mode, the microcontroller just stops executing instructions. It's not doing anything. It's waiting for something to trigger it to wake up. That might be you pushing a button. It might be an interrupt from the accelerometer saying the device moved. It might be a timer. It might be a BLE packet coming in. When it detects a trigger to wake up, it wakes up basically instantaneously. And that's because during light sleep, that 256K of RAM is powered. So while your program is not running, all of its state is sitting there ready to go. And so when the trigger happens, the device just starts running again and picks up where it left off. The nice thing, the really great thing about light sleep is it's completely automatic in Moddable SDK 4. So if your script isn't doing anything, we automatically activate light sleep. We do that very aggressively. So for example, even when we're animating at 60 frames a second, we will put the microcontroller to sleep in between those frames. So those are 17 millisecond intervals. If it takes us 1 millisecond to update the frame, it's probably less, but if it takes us 1 millisecond to update the frame, it's asleep for 16 out of 17 milliseconds. And so that saves a tremendous amount of energy. Just a few tips to make sure that your project is set up so that we can automatically manage light sleep for it. First, you want to reduce or eliminate polling with timers. Sometimes you can't completely eliminate it, and so you just have to, poll as infrequently as practical. But sometimes you can by using an interrupt source from a sensor, for example, and then you don't need to poll at all. And so you can stay in light sleep for minutes or hours at a time until something happens. To avoid blocking, you want to use APIs that have callbacks, promises, or async await, so that your main loop isn't stopping us from activating light sleep. And so that basically means write your project using events, as is typical in JavaScript, rather than an infinite loop, as is maybe a little bit more common in embedded environments in C, like Arduino. So super useful. The great thing about light sleep, since it's automatic, is that's where you always start. And for many projects, it may be that light sleep is enough. You don't always have to go further in power optimization, depending on your goals, but you'll still get the benefits of light sleep. As you might imagine, since we have light sleep, we also have deep sleep. And in the Nordic documentation, that's known as system off sleep mode. And it's an even lower energy mode than light sleep. The details matter. Exactly how much less depends on what you're doing. It might use half the energy. It might use 20% of the energy, depending on what features are enabled and how it's configured. During deep sleep, the microcontroller stops executing, but it also turns off RAM. And so that means your program state is completely lost. And so there's a few things you have to deal with then. Of course, the first is that waking up from deep sleep is effectively a reboot. Your system is restarting. And so that takes a little bit of time. It's not that much. It's like under a millisecond, probably, in most cases. But it's still some time, and that time is going to use some energy. So if you're waking from deep sleep very often, then it may be a better idea just to use light sleep. The clock is maintained, so elapsed time of day is still known. And the peripherals can be on or off depending on what you want. So we'll often, for example, build projects where in deep sleep, the microcontroller is off, but the screen is holding the last image that it drew. So to the user, it may look like it's still on, but actually it's off, and it will just respond to them very quickly once they do something. To get out of deep sleep, you need a wake trigger. These are basically the same triggers you can use to come out of light sleep: timers, analog inputs, digital inputs, sensor interrupts. And once you come out of deep sleep, you can check to see what trigger woke you up, so that you can take action based on that. You might do something different if it was a periodic timer that woke you from deep sleep versus the user pushing a button, for example. Just to give you a sense of what it's like to write code to wake from deep sleep, here's a few JavaScript examples. So the first one just sleeps the device for 2 minutes. That's 120,000 milliseconds. Once that expires, the device will wake up and restart your application. You can wait for a digital pin, like a button or an interrupt, to cross from up to down or down to up. And here you see waiting on digital pin 5 to fall. And so this will wake when the button is pressed. Or you can compose or combine these triggers to wake on multiple conditions. So you can see here on the example on the right that the analog pin crosses a certain threshold will cause a wake, as well as every 60 seconds, it will also wake. And so that gives you a lot of control over exactly when the device is going to be powered on. And to see how effective that can be, Here's an example energy use that we've measured on Moddable Four. We use deep sleep with 3 different wake triggers: wake on a timer, wake on a button, wake on an analog sensor. And then during this deep sleep, we keep the display on. And despite having all of those things active, the energy use is still only about 2.4 microamps. So very, very low energy, but giving you still lots of options in terms of how you save power. So a few tips on deep sleep. If you need to wake up often, light sleep may be the right choice for you. And so deep sleep is really powerful, really cool, and extremely useful. But don't go there first. Really start with light sleep, measure, see how things are performing for you, and then decide if it makes sense to use deep sleep. And start slowly. The deep sleep APIs are new for most people, and just take a little while to get used to, like anything new. And so we've got a pile of examples in the SDK that you can use to exercise all the different sleep features. And so before you integrate something into your project, we really recommend that you give it a try just in the examples to see that it's behaving the way you expect. I said that your state is all lost because RAM is powered down, and that's true, but there is a neat feature in the silicon to help you with that. There's 128 bytes of RAM called retention RAM that are stored across deep sleep. And so there's an API where you can write values into those 128 bytes and then retrieve them when the device wakes up. And so that's a really very lightweight way to store state that will let your application kind of pick up where it left off. If you're a longtime user of the Moddable SDK, you may be inclined to use preferences for that. And we generally don't recommend that. It'll certainly work, but they're really intended for long-term device configuration. They take a little bit longer to read and write. And so if you're just need to store a little bit of state for transient purposes in deep sleep, use that retained RAM instead. Something we've seen happen a few times, an easy mistake, is to leave the LED on. The LED takes energy, of course, also. And so you want to turn that off, or at least way down if you can, when you're in deep sleep, so that that's not taking power away from the rest of your project. And then an important tip is that deep sleep is only available in release builds. And so if you're using it, you, of course, during development, typically use a debug build, and deep sleep will not kick in then. That's mostly because the debugger connection runs over serial. And if we were to go into deep sleep, we would lose the connection to the computer. And so you couldn't really debug it anyway. And so just make sure when you're working in deep sleep, if it doesn't seem like it's doing anything at all, there's a good chance that's because you're using a debug build. There's a warning when you run that it's that you're doing that, but still just make sure not to do that. There's tons of resources available to help you learn more about deep sleep. We've got, in addition to kind of the overview documentation about the NRF52 port, there's a dedicated document in the SDK called NRF52 Low Power Notes, which covers everything that we've talked about here and a whole lot more. It also includes links to the Nordic documentation. So if you want to really dig into the mechanisms at the silicon level that underpin all of this, you can learn about that there. We also have a bunch of examples. As you can see on the right there, there's a suite of examples for testing all the different sleep APIs, and you can run all of those, explore the source, modify them. You know, there's a couple hundred examples in the Moddable SDK, and most of those run on the Nordic as well. So if you want to learn about how to do graphics on that screen, the Pew and Comodetto examples work. The touchscreen ones obviously don't, because there's no touchscreen here, but everything else does. The BLE examples, which is an extensive set, all pretty much work here as well. So, you know, you've got a lot of stuff to use as a starting point. If you're the kind of person who learns well through discussion and conversation and asking questions, We've got a really great discussions section on our GitHub repository, where you can ask questions, share what you've gotten working, and just discuss ideas with the community. The team here at Moddable monitors those discussions as well, and so we'll often jump in and help with try to answer things with our knowledge as well. So don't feel like you have to figure this out on your own. There's lots of resources out there and lots of people who can help. So we're still learning about ultra low power in JavaScript. Moddable 4 is a big step in that direction. It's ready for everybody to give it a try, but we don't know where all the limits are. And so what's really exciting is that there's new things to learn here for everybody. And new kinds of projects, things you couldn't do before are now like very easy. I've got a couple ideas for projects that I'm looking forward to building now that we've shipped this thing. So give it. We encourage you to give it a try. Moddable 4 is available now. The links to that, as you might imagine, are on the Moddable website. The price is really great. We wanted to make sure that it was in reach of anybody who wanted to explore and experiment in this space. And so we look forward to seeing what you do. So thank you for joining us here on the August community call. We'll do this all over again next month in September.